Hey, I'm Dave, and this is yet again Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm making my way through every English language Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X game ever released, and taking an in-depth look at each inside and out. In today's video, and something that I alluded to last week, I'm taking on a genre of game that in the previous 85 episodes here on Zilog and Moto, I haven't touched, and that's partially because, and I'll readily admit, I'm not a fan. This week's game is F-22 Interceptor from Electronic Arts. And as you may have guessed, this is a war/combat simulator based around flight. As you may have guessed based on the title of the game, F-22 Interceptor puts you into the cockpit of what would eventually be known as the F-22 Raptor from Lockheed Martin. Now, here's where it gets a little bit weird. F-22 Interceptor was released in the United States in September of 1991. However, the F-22 Raptor didn't take its first flight until 6 full years later, on the 7th of September 1997. So how did EA manage to make a combat flight sim around a jet that didn't exist? It's a really good question. I know very little about airplanes, and even less when it comes specifically to fighter jets, so this is going to be yet another review where I'm flying by the seat of my pants, pun fully intended. From what I can piece together from reading Wikipedia articles, while the F-22 Raptor didn't exist in a real capacity until 1997, its origins date back to another plane called the Lockheed YF-22. Apparently the Air Force was looking for the next big thing in jet fighters to replace the then current F-15 Eagle and F-16 Falcon models that you may have heard of. In fact, as crazy as this may sound, both the F-15 and F-16 are actually still in service all these years later, or at least as of October of 2020 if you're watching this video in the future, which probably contributes to those models being a little bit more well known. What about the F-22 Raptor? Well, going all the way back to June of 1981, the Air Force started kicking around the idea of what to do to replace the F-15 and F-16 models, to keep ahead of the Soviets as the Cold War was raging on. So eventually they came up with the idea of the ATF, or Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, whereby manufacturers would compete to come up with the design for what would be the new benchmark of air superiority. Essentially, two teams of military and aeronautics manufacturers formed, with Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics teaming up to produce the YF-22 prototype, and Northrop and McDonnell Douglas creating the YF-23. As you probably guessed, even though both planes were good candidates, the Air Force chose the YF-22 to become what we now call the F-22 Raptor. So why was F-22 Interceptor called F-22 Interceptor? Well, even though in April of 1991 the YF-22 was chosen as the winner of the ATF competition, it wouldn't be named the Raptor until 1997, and before that had the unofficial name of Lightning II, calling back to Lockheed's fighter from World War II, the P-38 Lightning, before that name was eventually used for the F-35, the F-22's replacement. Confused yet? Anyway, since the F-22 was still technically just in development during the production of the game, EA just threw Interceptor in due to it sounding cool and it providing that role in air combat at times. Okay, so now that we've had an unexpected history class in Air Force weaponry, how is the game itself? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but first, a look at the package. And this is F-22 Interceptor, a game that has sat on my shelf and collected dust for a few years now. Now, to be fair, with as many games as I have for the collection, that's normal for most of the titles that I have, but I'll be honest, had I not been doing this review, I don't know when I would have picked this up. I'm just not into war-type games, especially the more in-depth simulators, which I was afraid this was based on the name. However, as I'll get to in the review section, this is definitely a situation to where you shouldn't necessarily judge things by their cover. Speaking of covers, I actually like this cover a lot. It uses the standard early Electronic Arts formatting, splitting the top and bottom of the cover in two, and then having details about the title on the sides. Most recently, we saw this cover style with Crew Ball in episode 79, but in reality, EA used it from their debut on the Genesis until 1993 or so. The cover art is eye-catching, and I like how both the top and the bottom, they went with a wireframe design to the plane, kind of alluding to the futuristic design of the plane and how technically it didn't exist yet. Also, two other things I'll mention. At the bottom, it does reference that Advanced Tactical Fighter program I was referring to, that the F-22 came out of, and it makes me wonder if the game was simply designed around the ATF program in general, and if the YF-23 was chosen, the game itself would have remained the same and just focused on the YF-23 instead. The other thing I'll point out is the reference to the EA Air Force branding on the cover and at the top of the spine. Apparently, at the time, EA was thinking about setting up multiple vanity brands, with EA Air Force acting like the EASN or EA Sports as a grouping of titles. This was abandoned fairly quickly, however, with only F-22 Interceptor, LHX Attack Chopper, and Desert Strike getting this branding. More on Desert Strike in a minute. As far as condition goes, this copy of F-22 Interceptor looks good. It's in what I call the third generation EA case, which is when EA had gotten with the program, so to speak, and started to use cases that were actually the same dimensions as all the other Genesis clamshells. The outer cover is fully intact, with no scratching or other damage, and the hang tab is in place at the top of the box. As far as the inner cover goes, there's no sun bleaching or water damage anywhere, but if you look close, you can see where there's some unfortunate wear at the bottom, where it probably had slipped down below the plastic at some point and gotten a little bit beat up. Flipping over to the back, and this is a good design. That tagline of total air superiority at the top is great and eye-catching. There's some nice flavor text in the middle with a general description of the game, and then 4 varied screenshots with their own explanations, with a 5th larger one at the bottom of that all, if anything, serving to make the game look better than it actually does, which is definitely the goal of these back covers in trying to sell the game. EA did a really good job at the presentation here. Opening the case up, and here's where I get apprehensive on a war-related title, as I don't know just how complex it's going to be, and you usually find that out by how thick the manual is. But actually, the manual here is pretty normal. In fact, I think I've seen thicker ones on the early EA Sports titles. This copy of the manual is in good shape, and as far as the content goes, I like it. It does a good job of being in-depth about the game without just flooding you with too much information. And I feel like it fully explains everything in the game, so you can't complain about something being left out. Fun fact, if you look at the back cover around this time, EA always used to advertise upcoming games. In this case, the other 2 EA Air Force titles. But if you look closely at the back, well, you're probably thinking this Apache AHX Desert Madman looks a lot like Desert Strike. And it is. Apparently this was just an early name for Desert Strike, and yet another thing I learned when doing this review. Okay, enough about all that. Let's get to the game and blow some stuff up. So I'd mentioned before that I'm not super into military things. I'm just not. I appreciate the military, and actually both my grandfathers and at least one great uncle served in World War II, and my dad briefly attended West Point, but that mindset just didn't transfer to me. I think I saw a lot of the abuse, or character building, that the troops have to go through during basic training as a kid, and while I know it's necessary to an extent to weed out guys that just can't hack it, it just never sat right with me. And it probably didn't help that I had a recruiter that would call me every now and then during high school to try to get me to join up, and I was too nice to tell him to screw off. Even stuff like the Call of Duty or Medal of Honor series, while I enjoy playing the games due to the story elements, that's really the only reason why. All the different weapon configurations, vehicles, etc., they don't do anything for me. I'm a lover, not a fighter, what can I say? But having said all that, when I started this channel, I vowed to do my best to not let any preconceived notions about type of games or the content we're in influence my reviews, and to try to go into each game with an open mind. And I think I've done a good job of that so far, especially when looking at something like Erebiz in episode 59, where I'm definitely not a fan of the strategy genre in general, and even though the subject of the game was business in the airline industry, I still ended up liking it. So, if I can like Erebiz, well, hell, there's a chance I'll like any of the games in this catalog. Starting up F-22 Interceptor, first you're given a choice of difficulty levels, starting with Cadet, Easy, Training, Normal, and Combat, Hard. The game itself doesn't change in structure depending on which difficulty you choose, so in effect, all choosing a particular difficulty does is set how fast combat feels, how difficult the enemies are, and which computer-aided assist you're given. For instance, when playing in Cadet or Training, ground avoidance is turned on, which prevents you from crashing into the ground, except during missions where you have to land. But when playing in combat mode, you have to watch just how close you get to the ground on strafing runs, or else you'll be looking at a game over screen very quickly. I think the difficulty levels are well balanced overall. I personally played the game in training, normal difficulty, and while it provided a challenge, I wasn't overly frustrated with it. However, if you do have problems playing the game, I've got some really good news for you. Being that F-22 Interceptor is an earlier Electronic Arts game on the Genesis, and with its simulation nature, you shouldn't be too surprised to find out that in certain ways it feels like a computer game, versus a console game. Learner Research, the game's developer, had previously worked on Chuck Yeager's Advanced Flight Simulator, and in looking at that title, you can definitely see how it could be viewed as somewhat of a precursor to F-22 Interceptor. But why is F-22 Interceptor's possible PC origins a good thing for players? Well, due to the inclusion of a very interesting game options screen that seems reminiscent of something you would see in a PC title versus a console title, at least to me. You see, at any time during the game, the player can hit B and C together to bring up a game menu. With so many options, it was labeled a cheat menu on GameFAQs, even though its existence and even a description of all the various options is listed directly in the manual. This option screen allows you to change almost all facets of the game, including how fast the action is, how fast your controls are, how aggressive and defensive the enemies are, whether you have unlimited weapons and fuel, and even if you want to turn on invincibility for your fighter, plus a few other options as well. The sheer amount of options given to the player to customize the game is very impressive, and while obviously some of these options will remove the challenge from the game and should probably be avoided by players trying to beat the game honestly, others end up being incredibly helpful and definitely positively impact gameplay. For instance, one thing that you may find frustrating about the game is how slow and choppy the game moves by default. Now, some of that is due to the graphics, which I'll properly excoriate in a minute, but if you slow down the speed of the game or increase the speed of your controls, you'll quickly find the game much more playable and a bit less frustrating. Along with being able to modify the controls to make the game more playable, i.e. fun, having the option to turn on unlimited guns or missiles may be a necessary evil in some levels. The game is structured so that every few missions are connected, meaning that when you take off, you have a certain amount of fuel and ammunition to get you through each mission until the next refuel or landing mission. Well, what happens if you run out of ammo before getting to that next checkpoint? Normally, you'd be expected to commit suicide and lose a life, which refills all your ammunition and allows you to restart that mission. Even though in real life, you'd simply be able to fly away and fight another day. Rather than being stuck with the lame option of having to kill yourself, you can theoretically temporarily turn on unlimited ammo on either your missiles or your guns, finish up the mission, and then turn unlimited ammo back off again and take on the next level. While I can see the argument of the fact that this is still technically cheating, and you should have played better on the previous missions, to me this is just poor game design, putting you in an unwinnable situation, and having the option to cheat around that to continue your game is a fantastic inclusion, and definitely helps my opinion of the title. As far as the game content is concerned, F-22 Interceptor has plenty, and definitely what I would consider a lot for that particular point in time. When playing the game, you're given 7 choices. The first 4 are the main campaign of the game, divided up into blocks of 30 missions, starting with the United States, which acts as a training session, before moving on to North Korea, Iraq, and Russia, and all 4 are selectable from the beginning. You don't have to play them in order if you don't want to. The 5th option allows you to go through 9 levels of dogfighting against the computer, starting out with 1-on-1 matches versus the top pilot from each of the 4 mission areas, before eventually going up against 2-on-1 and then 4-on-1 handicap matches to determine just who the best combat pilot is. The last 2 options are a password resume option, which allows you to resume your game from the last mission you were on, and yes, every single mission has a different password. And then there's even an option that allows you to create your own custom missions, if the pre-configured ones are too boring for you, and you need an extra challenge. I certainly can't complain about the contents of the game, as there's plenty to keep you busy for a while. However, what I can complain about, and certainly will, is the game's, frankly, embarrassing graphics engine. To quote Jay Sherman, it stinks. There's a reason why I say that looking at a similar PC game from 1987 in Chuck Yeager appears to resemble F-22 Interceptor. Now, I know that any device, be it a console or home computer in 1991, is gonna have trouble rendering 3D graphics. And if you played any early flight simulators, Microsoft or otherwise, you probably know what I'm talking about. But even taking all that into consideration, this game looks positively prehistoric. The in-game action moves are at a speedy 1 frame per second. Maybe 2, I can't say for certain. And the graphics that are displayed at that horrendous frame rate consist of flat shaded polygons with severe aliasing on the edges. And as a kicker, the game looks like it was originally designed to run on a PC in 16 color low-res VGA mode, as while I didn't count the on-screen colors, I'd be shocked if any level features more than 16 colors at a time. One of the most hilarious things in the game is anytime a tree is displayed, which usually consists of a green circle with pixelated edges and a line attaching it to the ground. And I tell myself, I know 1991 was a different time, and the Genesis certainly isn't designed for 3D work, but holy crap, this game is hard to look at. Sound-wise, the game holds up slightly better, but there's not much here to rate. It's clear that the bulk of the game's memory went to housing all the mission assets. There's only one music track, that I can remember anyway, that loops the entire time you play the game. And it's not bad, but it's ultimately pretty forgettable, and the game thankfully gives you the option to turn off if you get sick of it. The sound effects hold up a bit better, with decent sounding gunfire, rocket launches, explosions, and even some audible speech warnings to try to give you an edge on the competition. The audio is serviceable, but it's clear it wasn't a priority from a design perspective. I mentioned earlier that when I was looking at the manual for F-22 Interceptor, well, it was a relief. I was worried that the manual would look like a brick, and if you've seen the manuals for 688 Attack Sub or M1 Abrams Battle Tank, you'll know what I mean, and those games specifically were why I was dreading this review for a bit. Some of these war simulator games are certainly more heavy on the sim part and less on the game portion. But in that regard, F-22 Interceptor is actually a pleasant surprise. Even with the poor graphics engine, the game actually plays well, and I like a lot of the little things that are thrown in, like the pilot blacking or redding out depending on how the G-forces you're pulling, the ability to be blinded by the sun, and having the cockpit screen be damaged if you take in a certain amount of fire. The game controls are simple, and you'll be in the air and dogfighting or lighting up ground targets in no time, and even landing is a breeze. After going back and forth a bit with myself, I finally settled on giving F-22 Interceptor 2 stars. This was a tough determination, as I was having to weigh the amount of content in the game and how it was definitely more fun than I was expecting, versus just how difficult it was to look at. However, if you're a fan of this genre, or war games in general, you may want to bump that up to a 3-star rating. I got about halfway through the Iraq campaign before I got bored, because there's only so many variations of the game that it can throw at you, but keep in mind, that's about 75 missions worth, and this isn't my type of game to begin with, so clearly Edward Lerner and the rest of Lerner Research got something right here. Also, this game isn't terribly valuable at the moment, with complete copies going for the low price of $6. So, if you're interested at all, you'll be out less than the price of a decent cheeseburger to try it out. Okay, and that was F-22 Interceptor. I've got to say, there were definitely aspects of this game that I liked a lot, and the sheer amount and variety of missions was a nice bonus, along with relatively simple gameplay. This was definitely not one of the war sim type of games that I feared, as I don't have the time nor the inclination to learn how to pilot a military vehicle, which is nice. One of the things that I enjoy the most about doing this channel is hitting a game that I normally wouldn't ever give the time of day, just due to how many other games that are out there that I actually want to play, and then having a decent time playing it regardless. Next week, we'll be back on the Master System reviewing a game that I first played for the Commodore 64 way back when. And I know, you might be asking, when are you doing another Sega CD or 32X game? It's been a while since Crime Patrol. And believe me, I wish I could do one to mix things up a bit, but unfortunately that gear is still in the shop. Hopefully I'll get it back before Thanksgiving and work in a few before the end of the year and the beginning of next season. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.